Narcissists think you're being protected by God. Actually, God is shielding them from you. They think God is protecting you. But the truth is far more terrifying. At first glance, it looks like you're the one who needed rescuing, the fragile one, the emotional one, the believer who clung too long and got hurt too deeply. To them, your exit is a sign of weakness, a dramatic collapse of someone who couldn't handle the fire. But that's not the truth, not even close. Because what happened between you and the narcissist wasn't just personal. It was spiritual. Something happened in the unseen. A line was crossed. A shift took place that you didn't fully understand at the time, but you felt it. You didn't just leave. You were removed. Not by your own power, not out of emotional exhaustion, but by something greater than both of you. God stepped in. There was no rage, no dramatic confrontation, no final explosion, just stillness, just clarity, just the unmistakable sense that this was it. And it didn't come from your mind or your pain, it came from heaven, a divine interruption that said, enough. You see, when God separates you from someone, especially someone manipulative, destructive, and unrepentant, He's not just protecting your heart, He's intervening in something much bigger. And though the narcissist may believe they had the upper hand, though they may mock your faith and mistake your silence for surrender, what really happened is this: God removed you before something in you rose up and answered their cruelty with a justice they couldn't survive. That's why the separation wasn't random. It was righteous. It was surgical. It was holy. And now we must take the next step and understand what God was declaring, not just over you, but over them. When God removes you, He's pronouncing judgment on them. There comes a point in every spiritually abusive relationship where heaven stops whispering warnings and starts making moves. You see, you may have believed your exit was about your survival, that the weight you were carrying finally broke your back, that your endurance reached its limit, but the truth is far more sacred and far more serious. You didn't leave when you were done. You left when God was done. And when God is done, it means judgment has begun. You may not have realized it in that moment, but something shifted in the atmosphere the day you stopped answering the phone. Something eternal was written, the moment your spirit said, no more, because the one who sits on the throne had already made his decision. And the decision wasn't just about pulling you to safety. It was about announcing a verdict against the one who refused to change. Long before you walked out, you prayed. You covered them. You fasted. You forgave things no one else would have forgiven. You held your tongue, bit back your truth, and begged God to intervene. Not to punish them, but to restore them. You wanted healing, not vengeance. You wanted reconciliation, not revenge. You weren't asking for an escape, you were asking for a miracle. But heaven doesn't always answer the way we expect. Sometimes, instead of healing a relationship, God closes it permanently. Not because your prayers weren't heard, but because their rebellion was louder. God gave them time to soften, time to repent, time to treat you like the sacred soul you are, time to lay down their pride and humble themselves. But every time they chose control instead of compassion, pride instead of peace, manipulation instead of mercy, they weren't just offending you, they were offending the God who sent you into their life as a gift. And when you treat a divine gift like it's disposable, you don't just lose the person, you lose the covering, the favor, the grace, the protection that came with them. When God removes someone like you, someone prayerful, faithful, forgiving, patient, from another person's life, it is never a small matter. That removal is a spiritual rupture. It is the lifting of divine mercy. It is the beginning of judgment. Not lightning and thunder, not yet, but silence, distance, absence, a holy coldness that settles in slowly but surely. And the narcissist, even if they can't articulate it, starts to feel it, that something sacred is gone, that something they didn't deserve has been withdrawn. The truth is, when you left, God wasn't just pulling you out of danger. He was pulling his light away from their darkness. And that is terrifying. Because when God removes light, judgment follows. Not always immediately, but surely. God may wait, but he never forgets. You were never just a partner. You were never just another voice in their story. You were a witness, an intercessor, a divine interruption in their downward spiral. And now your absence is an indictment, a signal that their time with God's grace, extended through your presence, has expired. It's not that they weren't warned. Your love was the warning. Your patience was the warning. Your silence at times was the warning. But when God saw that no matter how much grace was extended, they only grew bolder in their harm, he closed the door himself. And when God closes a door, no apology can reopen it. No tears, no regret, no future change. Because judgment doesn't come after one mistake. It comes after the last one in a long line of willful rebellion. That's why you must stop questioning your worth, your decisions, your spiritual instincts. You didn't leave out of fear. You were led out by the hand of the judge. And now, as we continue forward, you'll see just how deeply that divine judgment affects a narcissist, not only when they lose access to you, but when they realize they've lost access to God's mercy that came through you. Narcissism's shocked because it's the first time they've been discarded. One of the most disorienting moments in a narcissist's life isn't when they lose control. It's when they realize they've been discarded by the very person they thought would never walk away. You see, they're used to being the ones who leave, the ones who withdraw affection, withhold love, and rewrite the story to make themselves the victim. They thrive on being the one who gets the final word, the last look, the ultimate power. But when someone like you, someone full of mercy and long-suffering, finally goes silent, it confuses them. No, more than that. It shocks them to the core. They never expected it. You were the one who always gave grace. You forgave offenses that others would have walked away from long ago. You believed in their potential, even when they never showed proof of change. You prayed for them, you hoped for healing, you stayed longer than wisdom permitted, simply because you believed in redemption. But when you finally walked, not with rage, not with revenge, but with resolve, they felt something they had never truly felt before: rejection. Not the superficial rejection they use as an excuse to victimize themselves, but true, holy separation. A divine disconnection that their charm couldn't fix, their manipulation couldn't twist, and their lies couldn't explain away. And that's where the shock sets in, because they don't know what to do when the person they thought would always stay does. Suddenly, the games don't work. The silence they used as punishment no longer affects you, because you're gone. The triangulation falls flat, because you're no longer in the ring. Their fake apologies, their breadcrumb affections, their calculated pity, none of it touches you anymore. Not because you've been delivered from the need to be needed by someone who never valued your soul. And for the narcissist, that's more than a loss. It's humiliation. You see, they built their identity on controlling others, on being the center of your emotions, on knowing they could always pull you back in when they wanted to. But now, you're no longer reachable, and that terrifies them, because they weren't ready for you to become emotionally independent, spiritually grounded, healed in the places they hoped would always remain broken. They weren't ready for God to close the access. They weren't ready for your peace to become stronger than their chaos. And they weren't ready to be left behind. not by someone who knew them so deeply, loved them so patiently, and still walked away. And what haunts them most isn't that you're gone, it's that you're doing better without them. You're no longer drained. You're no longer doubting yourself. You're no longer carrying the shame that was never yours. You are smiling again, laughing again, believing again. And the narcissist, in their secret places, knows they lost something they will never find again. That's why your silence is louder than any argument. Your absence is more powerful than any sermon. You didn't need to expose them. You didn't need to shame them. Your absence did all the talking. And it continues to echo in every room they walk into, in every memory that replays at night, in every relationship that now falls short of the connection they destroyed with you. And here's the final twist. They didn't just lose you. They know they'll never get you back. Not because you're bitter, but because you've grown. Not because you're punishing them, but because God has pulled you forward and closed that chapter for good. So if you've ever second-guessed your decision to go quiet, to walk away, to let God have the final say, let this truth settle deep in your spirit. They're shocked because they never expected you to get free, but you did. And not only are you free, you're flourishing. Comment below with the words, "God pulled me out and I never looked back," if you've walked away in peace and watched heaven fight your battle. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was the sound of judgment falling in love with mercy and choosing you. They think God is protecting you, but the truth is more terrifying. They look at you and think you were the one who needed rescuing. You were the one constantly forgiving, constantly praying, constantly trying. You were the one in tears, the one on your knees, the one who stayed when everyone else would have run. To the narcissist, that made you weak. That made you someone easy to manipulate. They saw your compassion as a tool to be bent, your boundaries as lines to be crossed, and your love as something to consume, not respect. They thought God was protecting you because you were too broken, too fragile, too dependent to stand on your own. And for a while, maybe you believed that too. Maybe you thought God's silence during the pain meant you were being preserved, kept from the next blow, held together just enough to survive one more day. But in time, you began to understand something far more sobering. You realized that God wasn't just sheltering you from harm. He was sheltering them from the storm that was building inside of you. There is a dangerous shift that happens inside a soul that has loved relentlessly and been trampled without remorse. A sacred line that, when crossed, awakens a fire not fueled by rage, but by truth. It's not vengeful, it's not chaotic, it's not carnal, but it is dangerous, because it cannot be manipulated, it cannot be controlled, it cannot be silenced once it's been called forth. And God in His mercy stepped in before that line was crossed, not because you weren't capable of confronting your abuser, but because He saw how much damage you could do if you stopped letting Him restrain you. You see, the narcissist never knew how close they came to meeting the version of you that wouldn't have spared them. They thought your silence was submission, but it wasn't silence, it was sacred control. It was the sound of God's hand over your mouth. It was the sound of heaven holding back the sword. They thought your prayers were desperation, when in fact they were containment. They thought you stayed because you were helpless, but you stayed because God asked you to. And when He finally told you to go, you didn't just leave the relationship. You laid down the weapon He never allowed you to raise. Because let's be honest, you knew things. You saw things. You could have exposed them in ways that would have destroyed their reputation, their image, their future. You could have burned it all down and walked away with clean hands. But God said no. Not because it wasn't true, not because they didn't deserve it, but because He didn't want you to carry the weight of destruction, even if it was justified. God didn't want to just protect your heart. He wanted to protect your calling. He didn't want bitterness to attach itself to your spirit. He didn't want your legacy to carry the stain of a war. He never asked you to fight. That's why he stepped in. That's why he removed you when he did. Because the version of you that was about to rise in your flesh could have done more damage than your soul was built to carry. They thought God was shielding you from their rage, but they had no idea that God was shielding them from your anointing when it turns righteous. Because a person who has endured what you've endured, suffered how you've suffered, and survived what you've survived, and still holds the truth, is more powerful than any enemy they could have imagined. The truth in your mouth could have scorched the earth around them. The authority in your presence could have called every hidden deed into the light, but God restrained you, not to silence you, but to save you from becoming something He didn't call you to be. You weren't just a survivor, you were a vessel. And that's why the battle wasn't yours to finish. There's something terrifying about a person who chooses not to retaliate. Something deeply unsettling about someone who walks away not because they're afraid, but because they know they're capable of so much more, and they refuse to let that power be corrupted. That's you. That's who you became, and that's the version of you the narcissist never expected to meet. God's protection over you wasn't a wall to keep danger out. It was a cage to keep fire from consuming everything in its path. He knew that if you were pushed just one step further, you wouldn't have just confronted the narcissist. You would have unraveled every lie, every manipulation, every illusion they had carefully constructed. And it would have been righteous. But it would have come at a cost. So God said, "Let me handle it." And you obeyed. You let Him be judge. You let Him be defender. You let Him be the voice that would speak on your behalf when the time was right. And even though that obedience cost you closure, explanations, apologies, it saved your soul. And that's the part the narcissist will never understand. They thought you were hiding behind God, but the truth is God was holding you back, not because you were weak, but because you were dangerously close to becoming the consequence He never assigned you to be. That's the terrifying truth. Not that you were broken, not that you were rescued, but that you were restrained by heaven, because heaven trusted you with fire, and still called you to walk in peace. You are a restrained weapon, not a victim. You were never a victim in the way the world defines it. You weren't naive, you weren't foolish, you weren't incapable of walking away. You knew, long before the final goodbye, that something was terribly wrong. You saw the red flags. You felt the manipulation. You heard the subtle cruelty in their tone, the belittling masked as humor, the control disguised as concern. You weren't blind, but you were hopeful. You weren't helpless. You were patient. You stayed not because you couldn't leave, but because you wanted to believe. Believe that love could heal, that prayer could transform, that mercy could convict. You believed in redemption, not just for yourself, but for them. And that belief, that resilient, costly belief, was never weakness. It was strength most people don't possess. And that's what made you dangerous. You carried light into a place built on illusion. You brought truth into an atmosphere fed by denial. You offered a mirror to someone who refused to look at their own reflection. And instead of gratitude, you were met with resentment. Because narcissists don't hate lies, they hate truth. And you, simply by existing in integrity, became a threat to the entire system they built their identity upon. They didn't mistreat you because you were small. They mistreated you because you were significant. Because your presence made it harder for them to lie to themselves. Because every time they twisted the story, you stood there, quietly, consistently, being the evidence that exposed their deception. Your calmness disrupted their chaos. Your forgiveness convicted their manipulation. Your prayers were spiritual resistance against their emotional games. You weren't a victim. You are a weapon that refused to be used for evil. That's why the battle wasn't about escape. It was about restraint. You could have fought back in ways that would have left them in ruins, emotionally, socially, spiritually. You could have told the truth in places that would have shattered their image. You could have turned their games inside out with one word, one call, one revelation. But you didn't, and that wasn't passivity. That was self-governed power. That was the Spirit of God, mastering your strength, holding your sword, guarding your dignity. Do you know what it means when heaven trusts you with that kind of restraint? It means God saw your fire and gave it purpose. It means you were never called to be loud, but to be clear. Never called to destroy, but to discern. Never called to react, but to rise. God allowed you to feel the full weight of injustice without letting it deform your character. He let you walk through the valley of betrayal and still come out soft enough to love again, but sharp enough to never be fooled again. That's not what victims do. That's what warriors do. You're the kind of soul who bleeds quietly and heals without needing to prove your pain to anyone. You're the kind of heart that breaks and still believes. And that faith, that endurance, that refusal to let evil reshape your essence, that's what makes you dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. That's what makes you holy ground. That's why the enemy tried so hard to wear you down, because a weapon that doesn't even know how powerful it is the most unpredictable kind. But now you know. You weren't kept silent because your words had no weight, but because they had too much. You weren't delayed because you lacked direction, but because the time of your release would matter more than the strength of your voice. God has been shaping you, not shielding you, forging you, not forgetting you. He has hidden you, not to punish you, but to preserve you until the right moment when your story, your freedom, your clarity would pierce through someone else's fog and bring them out too. You are not the wreckage of what they did to you. You are the result of what God preserved in you. You are not the leftover of brokenness. You are the seed of holy resilience, watered in tears, raised in silence, and called forth in strength. What they tried to break didn't just survive, it transformed. So don't look at your scars as signs of defeat. Look at them as the etching of your training, proof that you were forged in fire and didn't burn, that you were wounded in battle and didn't lose your soul. You didn't just survive the narcissist, you outgrew them, outlasted them, and walked away with more of God, more of yourself, and more power than they ever imagined you could carry. Because the truth is, you were never the victim of that story. You were the weapon God withheld. Your departure was heaven's silent verdict. There are moments in life when the loudest sound you will ever hear is silence. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of divine finality. The kind of silence that doesn't seek to explain itself, doesn't need applause, doesn't beg to be understood, because it has already been settled in the courts of heaven. That is what your departure was. It wasn't just an emotional choice. It wasn't merely a response to pain. It was heaven's quiet gavel, falling in a room no one else saw. You didn't leave in haste. You left in obedience. And that obedience carried more weight than 1,000 arguments. You didn't storm out to make a statement. You didn't burn the bridge behind you. You simply walked, slowly, steadily, and with a peace that didn't make sense, even to you, because it wasn't your peace, it was God's. And that peace was the evidence of a judgment already written. Your exit wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. You were the last extension of mercy in that place, the last voice of prayer, the last presence of spiritual covering. You were the final warning that didn't sound like thunder, but like loyalty. You stood, you loved, you endured. You became the last open door through which God offered light, And when that light was mocked, minimized, and dishonored, when your heart was used as a shield to delay accountability, God didn't just call you out, He closed the door. And that's why the silence hit differently this time. Because you weren't just leaving someone, you were leaving behind access. And that access was never to your emotions alone. It was to the grace of God flowing through your life. The narcissist didn't just lose a relationship, they lost a revelation. They lost the last window through which heaven was still pleading. And your absence wasn't punishment, it was proof. Proof that God does not tolerate defiance forever. Proof that grace, when trampled long enough, withdraws without fanfare. Because when God judges quietly, He doesn't give speeches. He gives space. Space for the absence to speak, for the silence to echo, for the void to preach what the prophets no longer will. And the most chilling part? The narcissist won't even understand what they've lost until long after it's too late to recover it. They will try to replace you. They will tell themselves they've moved on. They'll craft narratives, new alliances, new distractions, but deep down, in the place they never show anyone, they will know something sacred is gone, not because you were perfect, not because you were their savior, but because your presence held back storms they never knew were forming. And when you left, the storm had no reason to wait anymore. Your quiet exit was never about revenge. It was not about proving a point. It was the quiet removal of divine protection. You didn't curse them. You didn't lift a hand. You didn't even speak ill. You just left. And with that leaving, the spiritual order shifted. What was once covered was now exposed. What was once delayed was now released. What was once withheld was now allowed. That is what happens when God says enough. The world teaches us that judgment is loud, dramatic, final, explosive. But heaven's judgment is often still. When Jesus stood before Pilate, He didn't defend Himself. He didn't argue. He didn't respond to the false accusations. He remained silent. That silence wasn't weakness. It was power. It was prophecy. It was judgment unfolding in real time, while the world mistook it for defeat. And your silence carried the same weight. It spoke without speaking. It testified without needing words. Because your absence is not just the end of a relationship. It is the evidence that the covering has been removed. And once the covering lifts, what remains must stand on its own. And when the narcissist finds themselves face to face with consequences, with exposure, with unraveling, they will remember your silence. They will remember the absence. They will remember the peace you carried out with you, and they will not be able to fabricate it again. They thought they could play with what was sacred. But God is not mocked, and when He removes His people, it is not only for their healing. It is for the fulfillment of justice. Quiet, complete, irreversible justice. That is what your departure was. Heaven didn't need to shout, it only needed to act. And it did, through you. What happened between you and the narcissist was never just a human separation. It was a divine shift, a heavenly ruling that unfolded in the quiet moments when you thought no one saw your suffering, when you cried behind closed doors, when you prayed in desperation and silence answered louder than any voice. You didn't just get out, you were released, not because you were losing, but because you were no longer assigned to that battle. Every moment you endured with grace was witnessed by heaven. Every time you forgave instead of retaliated. Every time you chose prayer instead of pride. Every time you waited for change that never came. God saw it all. And when He removed you, it wasn't because He'd forgotten your pain. It was because He had measured it, weighed it, and decided that justice would now speak where you no longer needed to. They will never fully understand what they lost when they lost you, because it wasn't just your kindness or your presence. It was the covering that came with you, the favor that protected them even when they were hurting you. And when God withdrew you, He withdrew that shield. What remains now is their reckoning and your restoration.